Welcome to this deep dive. And, today we have a really highly personalized mission curated just for you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
Because if you're listening to this, you're probably someone who tracks global trends, right? Someone who looks for those rare, those moments in history where basically everything just changes at once.
Exactly. Those big inflection points.
Right. So our goal today is to unpack this massive macro-level data report. It details the complete economic and social reinvention of Caribbean small states, or CSS.
And we are really going to look at how a whole cluster of small island nations completely transform themselves.
Yeah, and I don't mean just some gradual evolution. I mean a total ground-up reinvention, going from these agrarian, farm-based societies into, global tourism powerhouses, and they did it in just a few short decades.
It really is like opening a societal time capsule, but, playing it out and fast forward.
Yeah, fast forward is the right word for it.
The source material we're working from today is this really comprehensive macro-level presentation. It was specifically curated for policymakers and development economists.
So it's heavy on the numbers.
Very heavy. Tracks decades of data spanning wealth accumulation, demographic shifts, education, public health, and environmental impact.
But for you, the listener, the ultimate value here isn't just going to be memorizing a bunch of isolated statistics.
No, not at all. The real insight comes from seeing the connective tissue between these numbers.
Right.
We're going to explore how a single massive economic pivot at the top of a society directly rewires literally everything else.
Down to, like, a nation's life expectancy.
Exactly. Life expectancy, the literacy of its youth, and even the very carbon footprint it leaves behind.
I love that framing, honestly, because usually when we look at how a society evolves, it feels like watching a glacier move.
Yeah, it's a slow burn.
Right, you know what's happening, you can measure the displacement over a century maybe, but year to year, the changes are almost invisible. It's a generational thing.
But diving into this specific data, it's honestly jarring.
It really is. You can trace the exact moments where the old world ends and the new world just, begins.
And we're going to track the massive wins these nations secured.
Yeah.
Because there were huge wins in wealth and health.
Oh, absolutely. But we're also going to shine a light on the hidden traps they stepped into along the way.
The unintended consequences.
Yeah, the ghosts of this progress. We're talking about the paradox of highly educated young women being completely locked out of the workforce.
Or the sudden, really crushing rise of diseases of affluence.
And the urgent environmental crises, right? They're basically being forced to burn their own foundations just to keep the lights on.
Which is why I think we need to start by looking at the pure economic engine that drove this entire transformation.
Let's do it.
Because if you were to graph the baseline macroeconomic data of the Caribbean small states over this period, the trajectory is just breathtaking.
It's leapfrog growth.
Exactly. We're looking at an era of leapfrog growth. The total gross domestic product of the CSS region, and this is measured in constant 2015 prices, just to remove the illusion of inflation over time.
Right, the real value.
Right. It expanded from early figures around $11.3 billion to a staggering $43.4 billion.
Okay, let's pause and just visualize that scale for a second.
That's massive.
We're talking about nearly quadrupling the economic output of an entire region. And when you break that down to the individual level,
The per capita numbers.
yeah, the GDP per capita, the average economic output per person, it broke through the $16,000 mark, up from early figures of roughly $4,400.
That is an exponential explosion of wealth in a single generation.
A person born in the early days of this data set literally grew up in a fundamentally different financial universe than their children will.
They absolutely did. But the data also reveals the intense, almost violent friction of that growth.
Yeah, it wasn't a smooth ride.
Not at all. It wasn't some elegant glide into prosperity. It was a rocky road accompanied by severe, destabilizing economic volatility.
The inflation spikes.
Right. When we examine the GDP deflator, which is this broad, comprehensive measure of inflation across the entire economy, we see that it peaked at over 25% in certain years during this transition.
Okay, a 25% inflation spike. Let's translate that into daily human life for a second.
It's devastating.
That is the kind of number that completely upends a household. You go to the market to buy basic staples, flour, cooking oil, building materials for your home, and the prices are just unrecognizable from the year before.
Savings just evaporate.
Exactly. wages suddenly don't cover the grocery bill. So how does an economy that is objectively getting so much wealthier simultaneously punish its citizens with that kind of price explosion?
Well, that is the paradox of rapid growth in a really constrained geography.
The island effect.
Precisely. When you have incredibly fast economic expansion in small, import-dependent island economies, you run headfirst into physical and logistical bottlenecks.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
The mechanics are actually fascinating. These states were generating wealth quickly, mostly through massive foreign direct investment flowing in to build infrastructure and resorts.
Okay.
That capital creates local jobs, right? It puts money directly into people's pockets. So local demand for goods just skyrockets. People suddenly want better food, new appliances, cars, construction materials to upgrade their homes.
But because it's a small island, they aren't manufacturing those refrigerators or cars locally.
No.
They aren't even growing enough food to feed this sudden boom in consumer demand.
Exactly. They completely lack the internal manufacturing base and the economies of scale to absorb that new spending power.
So everything has to come in from the outside.
Every single thing that newly wealthy population wants has to be imported on a ship. And ports on small islands can only process so many shipping containers a day.
Right. There's a physical limit.
When the sheer pressure of local demand outstrips the physical capacity of the supply chain, or if there's even a minor hiccup in global shipping, you get massive systemic shortages.
Too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly. Money is chasing a rigidly limited supply of goods, and that triggers those devastating 25% inflation spikes.
It's like pouring a fire hose of foreign capital through a garden hose of local supply chain infrastructure.
That's a great analogy.
Something is going to burst, and in this case, it's the price tags. And, while that economic roller coaster is happening on the macro level, the actual physical landscape of where people are living is changing just as dramatically.
Oh, the demographic shift is staggering.
The data shows this massive tidal wave of people moving from the countryside to the cities.
The urbanization numbers are really the second major pillar of this transformation. Over the period studied, the urbanization rate jumped from 32.2% to over 51.4%. At the same time, the overall population density steadily climbed from 6.56 to over 11.2 people per square kilometer.
Okay, I really want to focus on that 51.4% number because crossing that 50% threshold, that is a profound psychological and sociological tipping point.
It changes everything.
Right. For the first time in the history of these islands, more people live in the urban centers than out in the country.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. I imagine that is like moving a rapidly growing family into an apartment that isn't getting any bigger.
Yeah.
You just keep adding people to the living room, the kitchen, the hallways. You mentioned bottlenecks with the supply chain earlier. The immediate physical pressure this sudden densification puts on city infrastructure, power grids, housing, plumbing, it has to be overwhelming.
Your apartment analogy gets right to the heart of the municipal crisis these governments face.
So.
Because crossing that 50% urban threshold fundamentally alters the basic fabric of a society. It changes the nature of survival. When a population is mostly rural and distributed, risk and support are also distributed. Communities rely on extended family networks, local agricultural resilience, foraging, and decentralized off-grid living.
If there's an economic downturn, a family in a rural village still has a plot of land to grow food.
Exactly. They have a well. They have a localized safety net.
They aren't paying rent to a landlord, and they aren't relying on a municipal power plant to keep their food cold.
But when you migrate the majority of that population into dense urban centers, that ancestral safety net vanishes overnight.
It's just gone.
Completely gone. The burden of support shifts entirely from the community network to the centralized state. Suddenly, the government is on the hook.
They have to provide everything.
High-density housing, centralized sanitation, stable electricity, and centralized food distribution networks. And they have to do it for a rapidly expanding population that no longer has the means to support itself independently.
Right. If the power grid fails in a modern city, it's not just an inconvenience.
No, within days, it becomes a public health emergency.
And we have to ask the obvious question here. Why are they all moving?
The big question.
All these people packing up and leaving their ancestral rural villages for the crowded cities, they aren't moving just for a change of scenery.
No, they're moving out of necessity.
Right. They're moving because the ways they used to make a living simply don't exist anymore. Which brings us to what I consider the most dramatic plot twist in the entire Caribbean small states story.
The death of farming.
Yes, the absolute death of farming and the explosive rise of the resort.
If you look at the employment data, the primary sector, specifically agriculture, experiences a total unmitigated freefall.
Just a collapse.
Its overall share of employment collapsed down to just 6.7%.
Wow.
And when you look at male labor specifically, male participation in agriculture plummeted from nearly 24% down to just 9.4%.
If you were to graph that, it wouldn't even be a gentle, natural economic slope. It looks like a staircase falling off a cliff.
It's an industry hollowing out.
Why did a region with such a long history of agrarian production suddenly abandon the fields entirely?
Because the data proves that agriculture had become an entirely unsustainable, deeply volatile economic pillar for these states.
The numbers back that up.
Oh, strongly. The analysis highlights massive negative growth years for agricultural value-added production. We are talking about years where the sector contracted by an astonishing 16.3%.
Wait, really? A minus 16% contraction in a single year?
Yes.
That isn't just a bad harvest. That is an industry-wide collapse.
It is the brutal reality of geography. Small island states face unique, almost insurmountable vulnerabilities in the primary sector.
Like the weather.
Exactly. First, you have the environmental shocks. A single Category 5 hurricane can wipe out an entire nation's agricultural GDP overnight.
Just gone in a day.
It destroys the crops, salinates the soil, and wrecks the transport infrastructure. But second, you have global market realities.
Right, competing with the mainland.
A small island simply lacks the arable landmass and the economies of scale to compete on price with massive mechanized global agricultural conglomerates in places like North America or South America.
So they were getting priced out of the global market while absorbing all the local environmental risk.
Exactly. The math just stops working. The farmer realizes that no matter how hard he works, a single storm can bankrupt him, or a mega farm half a world away can undercut his prices to the point of ruin.
So they abandoned the fields.
They had to.
But they have to go somewhere. They have families to feed in those new urban apartments we talked about. And the data shows us exactly where they went. To the coasts, to cater to foreigners.
The scale of the pivot toward international tourism is breathtaking. Over this period, international tourist arrivals skyrocketed from around 600,000 visitors to a staggering peak of nearly 20 million arrivals.
20 million visitors flowing through small island nations. That is just a logistical marvel.
And it completely rewired the financial reality of the region. Commercial service exports, which is the economic category driven heavily by tourism, surged from negligible amounts to over $15 billion.
15 billion.
It became the absolute core foreign exchange earner. And tracking that labor shift we just discussed, as male employment in agriculture plummeted, male employment in the service sector jumped from 40% to over 59%.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around the psychological scale of that shift for you, the listener. It's like a massive legacy corporation completely abandoning its founding product overnight.
That's a great way to think about it.
Imagine a company that built physical typewriters for a century. Suddenly they realize typewriters are dead, so they fire all the factory workers, immediately rehire them and tell them, you are now selling cloud computing software. It is a total rewiring of the nation's DNA. You go from a society of independent producers physically working the land to yield a tangible crop to a nation of service workers whose entire economic existence relies on catering to the leisure and comfort of wealthy foreigners.
It is a profound cultural shift. You're moving from the production of goods to the production of experiences.
But I have to push back on this economic model a bit because looking at it from the outside, hasn't this region just traded one fatal vulnerability for another?
How do you mean?
I mean, yes, a hurricane wiping out the banana crop is a disaster, but isn't a global economy built on tourism just as fragile?
Yes.
A global pandemic, a spike in jet fuel prices, or a massive economic recession in the US or Europe completely stops international travel. Tourism is a luxury good. It's the very first thing families cut from their budget when times get tough. Aren't these small states just as exposed to ruin as they were when they relied on farming?
That is the defining debate in development economics right now. And you hit on the exact vulnerability. They absolutely traded localized environmental vulnerability for globalized market vulnerability. Yeah. They are highly exposed to macroeconomic shocks originating in countries thousands of miles away. However, What the data heavily suggests is that while international tourism is volatile, its ceiling for wealth generation is infinitely higher than export agriculture for a small geography.
Because tourists bring in pure cash rather than demanding the export of physical commodities.
Exactly. Tourism serves as a magnet for massive foreign direct investment. Global hotel chains come in and build billion-dollar properties.
Right.
That requires modernizing airports, expanding deep-water ports for cruise ships, and laying down high-speed internet cables. Agriculture on a small island will never generate the capital required to build a modern international airport.
But tourism does.
Tourism does. It forces the modernization of the entire country's infrastructure to support the visitor, which theoretically benefits the local population as well.
Which brings us to the next massive question. We have this economy completely rewired to serve 20 million tourists and an urbanized population. They've generated a $33 billion GDP.
Right.
But did everyone actually get a piece of this new pie? When we pull back the curtain on the labor market, we find an incredibly complex picture. On a macro level, it looks like a massive win.
It does. Overall, unemployment dropped from historic highs of 17% down to a very stable 7.4%.
In a rapidly urbanizing environment, taking an unemployment rate of 17% and halving it is an undeniable victory for macroeconomic policy.
The service sector clearly absorbed a massive amount of the labor that fled the agricultural sector.
But when you dig into the demographics of who exactly is getting those jobs, you uncover a massive hidden inequality, a structural barrier that the tourism boom completely failed to fix.
Yes. We were talking about youth, female unemployment, specifically women between the ages of 15 and 24.
The numbers here are tough to look at.
They really are.
Mm-hmm.
The historical baseline for this demographic has been disastrous, reaching as high as 39% at certain points.
Wow.
And even with the service sector booming, even with $15 billion in service exports, the youth female unemployment rate stubbornly remains at a highly elevated 23.2%.
Nearly 1 in 4 young women is completely locked out of the formal workforce. And before we try to diagnose why that is happening, we really need to look at what their daily life actually looks like.
The contrast is striking.
Because the data presents this incredible paradox regarding their standard of living. At the exact same time that a quarter of young women can't find a job, the basic infrastructure of the countries they live in has reached near developed world status.
The infrastructure data is phenomenal. Urban electricity access has reached 99.6%. It is virtually universal.
Almost everyone has power.
Urban access to basic sanitation reached 94.3%. And even out in the remaining rural areas, sanitation saw dramatic improvements, rocketing up from a meager 3.4% baseline to modern levels.
So here is the stark contrast I want you to picture. You have a young woman living in one of these newly densified cities. She lives in a perfectly lit, fully modernized home.
She has running water, safe sanitation.
Right, she is fully integrated into a modern, reliable electrical grid. The physical hardware of her life is totally modern. Yet she steps outside her door and faces a roughly 25% chance of being completely excluded from the very economy that built that grid.
This raises an important question. Why? Globally, the transition from heavy agriculture or heavy industrial manufacturing toward a service-based economy is typically a massive boon for female employment.
Right, because it's less physically demanding manual labor.
Exactly. Service sectors, hospitality, retail, and administration globally tend to absorb high numbers of women. So why is a booming service economy in the Caribbean failing to absorb its young female population?
Well, usually when politicians or economists see high youth unemployment, they immediately point the finger at the schools.
Wait.
The scapegoat is always education. You hear the standard talking points, right? The youth just don't have the skills for the modern economy. The schools are failing. They assume there's a massive skills deficit.
But the data in this report shatters that argument completely.
Utterly shatters it.
If we look at the metrics for basic education, the region has achieved historical leaps. Lower secondary school completion, which is a crucial metric for basic workforce readiness, leaped from 61.7% to a massive 91.7%.
That's huge.
Primary school dropouts have been essentially eradicated. The basic education system is functioning at a level comparable to many developed nations.
And it gets even more pronounced when you look at literacy. The youth literacy rate for ages 15 to 24 sits at a stellar 96%.
Which is incredible.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Here's the gender twist that completely upends the skills deficit argument. Women are heavily outperforming men.
Yes.
Female youth literacy is 97.4% compared to male literacy at 94.6%.
The data uses a metric called the Gender Parity Index, or GPI.
Can you explain how that works?
Sure. In statistics, a GPI of exactly 1 means perfect equality between the sexes. Anything over 1 means females are achieving at higher rates than males. In these Caribbean small states, the GPI for youth literacy is hovering around 1.03.
So they're ahead.
Young women haven't just closed the historical educational gap, they have eliminated it and are actively leading. In some recorded years within the dataset, female lower secondary completion reached absolute peak levels of 98.5%, leaving the boys significantly behind at 84.1%.
This is where it gets deeply frustrating and frankly fascinating from a sociological perspective.
Very much so.
I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a young woman in this system. You did everything society asked of you. You stayed in school, you studied hard, you got the grades.
Everything right.
Right. You graduated at a significantly higher rate than the boys in your neighborhood. You are highly literate and ready to work. And your reward for playing by all the rules and succeeding, you hit a 23% unemployment wall.
It's a structural failure.
Meanwhile, the young men, the ones who dropped out of school at higher rates, are getting hired to work in the resorts, drive the transport vehicles, or build the new hotels.
For a policymaker, this is a textbook example of why looking at isolated data is dangerous and why synthesizing multiple perspectives is vital.
Because if you just look at education...
Right. If an education minister only looks at the schooling data, they are popping champagne. It looks like a total, unequivocal victory for human development.
But it's only half the picture.
Exactly. But when you overlay that education data with the labor data, it reveals a profound and damaging societal friction. The high youth female unemployment is absolutely, categorically not a skills deficit.
They're overqualified, if anything.
These women are highly educated.
Yeah.
What we are looking at is a systemic failure of the economy to utilize its most qualified human capital.
So what is the mechanism behind that failure? If it's not education, what is causing this structural bottleneck? Is it that the tourism industry preferentially hires men for the visible roles? Or is it that the massive construction boom required to build all these infrastructures is just soaking up male labor while leaving women behind?
It's a confluence of factors, and you touched on a major one. The physical expansion of a tourism economy requires endless constructions of new hotels, new airports, road expansions.
Tons of heavy labor.
Construction is a sector that globally, and especially in this region, heavily favors male employment. That absorbs a huge portion of the male workforce, regardless of their educational attainment.
That makes sense.
But beyond the sectoral skew, there is a deep cultural friction. In many small island economies, there are entrenched cultural norms regarding who is considered the primary breadwinner, which influences who gets hired first for limited formal positions.
So we're talking about a society that has modernized its economic engine, but perhaps hasn't modernized its cultural expectations of gender roles.
Precisely.
Uh-huh.
Furthermore, consider the nature of service sector jobs in a global tourism hub. Hospitality often requires shift work, night shifts at hotel front desks, weekend work in restaurants, erratic hours based on tourist seasons.
Hard to plan a life around.
Very. And these demanding, irregular schedules are often deeply incompatible with the caregiving responsibilities that disproportionately and often unfairly fall on the shoulders of young women in these societies.
Ah, the childcare trap.
If there is no affordable state-sponsored childcare infrastructure, a highly educated young mother literally cannot take a night shift at a resort.
It's just not an option.
So, to use a technological metaphor, the economy modernized its hardware, the electrical grid, the plumbing, the school buildings, but it hasn't fully updated its cultural software regarding labor participation in caregiving.
Updating the cultural software, that perfectly encapsulates the friction. We have a highly educated female population trapped in an economic structure that isn't designed to accommodate them.
Exactly.
Now, let's shift our focus from the health of the economy and the mind and turn to the literal physical health of the body. Because this economic leap, this shift from fields to cities, from farming to resorts, has completely fundamentally rewritten how people in the Caribbean live and, more importantly, how they die.
And much like the economic data, the initial health statistics are universally positive, reflecting an era of immense medical triumph.
The life expectancy numbers are wild.
Over the period of this economic transformation, life expectancy at birth made a massive leap, extending from 60.3 years to 73.1 years. You are looking at an entire population gaining over a decade of life.
That is a staggering achievement. And when you look at the beginning of life, the victories are even more pronounced. The data tracking maternal and child health shows incredible progress.
Oh, the drop in mortality is huge.
The maternal lifetime death risk plummeted from 0.60%, which means historically, 1 in every 170 women died from pregnancy-related causes, down to just 0.12%, or 1 in 860.
That drop is a direct result of those infrastructure improvements we discussed earlier.
The grid again.
When you have 99% access to electricity and 94% access to modern sanitation, you have sterile hospitals, reliable refrigeration for medicines, and safe water for childbirth.
It's all connected.
Furthermore, the teenage fertility rate for women ages 15 to 19 was cut by more than half, dropping from 135 to 61.9 births per 1,000 women.
Which ties perfectly back into the education data. Young women are staying in school longer, they are highly literate, they have better access to reproductive education and family planning, and as a result, they are having children later and surviving childbirth at vastly higher rates.
Everyone is living over a decade longer.
It sounds like the ultimate human success story. But
there is a trap hidden inside that longevity. Demographers call it the aging trap.
the aging trap.
Because people are living much longer and birth rates are stabilizing, the demographic shape of the society is changing. The data shows the old age dependency ratio, which measures the proportion of elderly people relative to the working age population, is steadily climbing from 7.1% to over 14%.
So what does this all mean? It means the demographic dividend is coming to an end. That sweet spot where you have a massive, young, working-age population generating taxes and wealth, supporting a relatively small elderly population, that ratio is flipping.
Exactly. The workforce will increasingly have to support a larger, older population. And this leads us to what is arguably the most alarming data point in the entire analysis.
The cause of death data.
It's the metric detailing the causes of death. We are witnessing a massive structural disease shift.
Historically, in developing agrarian nations, what kills people? It's infectious diseases, waterborne illnesses, malnutrition, and maternal mortality.
Diseases, poverty.
Right. But the data shows that those historical killers now account for only 11% of deaths in the Caribbean small states. The massive, overwhelming threat now comes from non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
It's a total flip.
We are talking about heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and cancer. These NCDs now account for a staggering 77.4% of all deaths. Injuries and accidents make up the remaining 10.6%.
What the data maps out here is a phenomenon known in public health as the epidemiological transition.
The epidemiological transition.
Yes. It is the biological and physiological consequence of every single socioeconomic shift we have discussed today. Think about the human body. You take a society that spent centuries doing hard, physical, calorie-burning labor in the agricultural fields.
Right, out in the sun, moving all day.
They were eating locally grown, unprocessed, albeit sometimes scarce, foods. Then, in just a few decades, you rapidly urbanize them. You move them into dense cities. You put them into sedentary service sector jobs, standing behind a hotel desk, driving a taxi, working in an office.
And their diet completely changes because the local farms disappeared.
Yes. You replace the local crops with imported, highly processed, calorie-dense, high-sodium foods.
It says it's cheaper.
Because it's cheaper and easier to import processed foods to an island than fresh produce. And then, thanks to the miracles of modern sanitation and basic medicine, you keep those people alive into their 70s.
The human body simply wasn't given time to adapt to that radical shift in environment. It is like training your entire life to win a sprint. You cross the finish line completely exhausted, and the officials walk up to you and say, "Congratulations on surviving the sprint." Now, without taking a breath, you have to immediately run a 100-mile ultramarathon.
That's a painfully accurate metaphor.
These nations successfully conquered the immediate, fast-acting survival issues of the 20th century: starvation and infection. But by doing so, and by adopting a modern, sedentary, import-heavy lifestyle, they unlocked the incredibly expensive, slow-burning, decades-long health crises of the 21st century.
And the fiscal implications of this transition are terrifying for a small state budget. Treating a population for infectious diseases is, relatively speaking, highly cost-effective.
Right. You build a well.
You run a massive one-time vaccination campaign for the youth. You provide antibiotics. You build a water treatment plant. Once the infrastructure is there, the disease is largely managed. but treating an aging population for chronic, non-communicable diseases.
It's endless.
That requires an entirely different, vastly more expensive healthcare paradigm.
Right, because you don't just cure diabetes or heart disease with a single shot.
Exactly. You are managing chronic decline. It means providing decades of daily insulin. It means building specialized dialysis centers. It requires long-term chemotherapy, bypass surgeries, and a massive network of specialized continuous care.
Which all costs a fortune.
As that old age dependency ratio creeps up past 14%, and as 77% of those elderly citizens develop chronic NCDs, the sheer fiscal burden of treating these diseases of affluence is going to put a massive, potentially unsustainable strain on that newly acquired $43 billion GDP.
It is a profound and dark irony. The very wealth that bought them modernized infrastructure and longer lives is currently funding the dietary and sedentary lifestyle that guarantees those longer lives will be sick.
It's a closed loop of consequences.
But as we transition to the final section of our deep dive, we have to look beyond the human body. Because it isn't just the citizens absorbing the hidden, delayed costs of this rapid modernization. The physical islands themselves, the reefs, the forests, the air are paying a devastating price. The environmental bill is coming due.
And the data tracking this environmental cost is stark. As the economy shifted and the cities grew, industrial CO2 emissions grew substantially, rising from a mere 1.13 megatons to peaks breaking 1.7 megatons.
Which is significant for small nations.
But the real culprit is the energy sector. Energy and electricity-driven carbon emissions spiked dramatically, jumping from roughly 2.7 to over 7.7 megatons.
Tripling the carbon emissions just to keep the grid online. And when we connect this to the broader global context, the cruel irony of the situation becomes almost painful to look at.
It really does.
The Caribbean small states are among the most geographically vulnerable territories on Earth to the effects of climate change. They are the ones facing the immediate existential threats from sea level rise swallowing their coasts, ocean acidification destroying the coral reefs that protect their shores, and increasingly violent hypercharged hurricanes.
And yet,
to achieve their economic success, they have been forced to massively inflate their own carbon footprints.
if we connect this to the bigger picture, the math of their economic model just demands it. To power those newly densified urban grids, to ensure the water pumps keep running for 94% sanitation access, to keep the lights on for 20 million international tourists.
And the air conditioning.
Right, to run the air conditioning in massive resort complexes 24 hours a day. They have no choice but to burn immense amounts of imported fossil fuels.
And it goes beyond just carbon emissions. The analysis also tracks the broader ecological cost of this growth. It measures natural resource depletion, which the data shows is highly volatile, but in certain years it eats up as much as 20.2% of their gross national income.
That's a fifth of the economy.
Net forest depletion also occasionally spikes over 1.5% of GNI as land is cleared for urbanization or resort development.
This brings us to a crucial concept in environmental economics known as green savings.
Green savings, how does that work?
Traditional economics just measures GDP, how much money did you make this year? But green savings adjusts that number by subtracting the value of the natural resources you permanently destroyed to make that money.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The core idea is that accumulating a massive GDP means absolutely nothing in the long run if you are simultaneously liquidating your foundational natural resources to achieve it.
It creates an illusion of wealth. I mean, to use a stark analogy, it is essentially like surviving a brutal winter by ripping up your own house's floorboards to burn in the fireplace.
That's exactly what it is.
Sure, the thermometer in the living room says it's nice and warm right now, and you aren't freezing to death. But your foundation is literally disappearing beneath your feet. Eventually, you run out of floorboards, and the house collapses.
The bill comes due.
But I have to play devil's advocate here because we are looking at this from a very macro, perhaps privileged perspective. Is it actually fair for the global community to point at these small, developing states and demand that they restrict their growth, stay green, and limit their carbon footprint when they are just trying to build the exact same comfortable, modernized, air-conditioned lives that people in larger developed nations have enjoyed for over half a century?
It is one of the most profound moral and economic dilemmas in global development. Historically, the developed world, North America, Europe got incredibly rich by polluting without restriction for over a century.
Right, they built their wealth on coal.
And now, having secured their wealth and infrastructure, They're turning to the developing world and asking them to get rich without polluting. It feels inherently hypocritical and deeply unfair.
It really does.
However, the tragedy of the Caribbean small states is that their geography simply does not care about fairness.
Mother Nature doesn't care about historical economic equity.
Exactly. If a massive continental nation degrades its environment, it has physical buffers. It can perhaps migrate its agriculture hundreds of miles inland or spend trillions to build massive seawalls to protect its coastal cities.
They have space to retreat.
But if a small island nation destroys its localized reefs, pollutes its highly limited freshwater aquifers, and contributes to the rising sea levels that are eating its beaches, it ceases to exist. They simply do not have the geographical buffer or the sheer landmass to make the same environmental mistakes the developed world made and survived.
Which brings us to a profound crossroads for this entire region. When we synthesize everything we have unpacked today, the wealth, the health, the labor, the environment, we are left with a comprehensive snapshot of a society that has reached the absolute limits of its current trajectory.
They achieved the dream that almost every developing region chases. They defied the odds. They multiplied their regional wealth by a factor of 4.
They built the modern infrastructure.
They brought power and water to millions. They educated their youth to the point of achieving remarkable gender parity and literacy. And they extended the lifespans of their citizens by over a decade. It is, by many traditional metrics, an undeniable historic success story of human development.
But the ghosts of this rapid progress are now haunting them, and they are demanding a reckoning. You have a massive cohort of highly educated, highly literate young women who are hitting a structural, cultural wall locked out of the economic boom.
The 23%.
You have a healthcare system that conquered the infections of the past, only to find itself bracing for a crushing, profoundly expensive wave of chronic diseases, of affluence, the diabetes and heart disease fueled by sedentary lives and imported diets.
And beneath it all,
you have an environmental model that relies on burning fossil fuels to power the very resorts that are slowly degrading the pristine natural beauty those 20 million tourists are paying to see.
the analysis makes one thing abundantly clear. The traditional path to wealth, moving everyone to the city, abandoning agriculture for a service-based economy, and continuously increasing energy consumption has basically run its course for these fragile island geographies.
That model is no longer sustainable.
No, they're going to have to find a completely new paradigm.
And that leaves you, the listener, with something deeply important to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We started by calling this data a time capsule of a society playing out in fast forward. But as we look at the intertwined crises of structural inequality, chronic health epidemics, and environmental degradation, maybe the Caribbean small states aren't just a time capsule of the past.
What do you mean?
Maybe they are the ultimate test lab for humanity's future. If the traditional globalized model of wealth generation inherently leads to environmental peril and diseases of affluence, can these small island nations pioneer something entirely different?
A blue economy.
Exactly. Can they invent what economists are calling a blue economy? A system that sustains their incredible gains in health and wealth, integrates their educated youth, but does so without sinking the very islands they live on? Or, tragically, are they locked into a global economic model that is fundamentally incompatible with their geography?
It's a massive question.
It is a question of survival, not just for them, but perhaps eventually for all of us. Something for you to ponder long after you hit pause. Because whether the change takes centuries to unfold like a glacier or happens in just a few decades and fast forward, we are all ultimately living in an apartment that isn't getting any bigger. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.